So to provide a brief introduction, Nada Wolff Culver is the Deputy Director of Policy and Programs for the Bureau of Land Management. Before coming to BLM, she most recently served as the Vice President of Public Lands and Senior Policy Counsel for the National Audubon Society. Before that, when I first met Nada, she was Senior Counsel and Senior Director for Policy and Planning at the Wilderness Society, managing the BLM Action Center in Colorado. She began her career in the private sector, working on a variety of environmental issues, including energy development and environmental remediation, and was a partner with the law firm Patton Boggs. She's a graduate of Northwestern University and the University of Pennsylvania School of Law. Welcome to the National Wilderness Skills Institute, Nada.
Thanks, Dan. And thanks to everyone for having me here today. And thanks for the intro, Dan, and reminding me how we met. And as you can probably tell from that intro, wilderness and wild places are very important to me. And I'm very honored to have a chance to be part of this institute, even if my skills might not be as up to snuff as all of yours by the time you're done here. You know, when Dan asked me for a title for these remarks, I thought about how many different ways we all interact with wilderness and the wild in general, and how many different types of skills are part of managing and enjoying these lands and waters. And I came up with terrible titles like being skillful on public lands. And I think Dan settled on something about finding creativity in public lands management. And that's really the overall idea today, to give an overview of how the Bureau of Land Management plays a role in managing wilderness and wild and scenic rivers now and into the future, and hoping that will really tee up some good questions and discussions with all of you. And, you know, when I tell people about the Bureau of Land Management, since the time that I started the BLM Action Center back in the day at the Wilderness Society, and now that I have the privilege to work here, I say, we do all the things, or hashtag all the things, if we're trying to be cooler and we don't want to just point out that we have a starring role in White Lotus. But you get the idea. We have an incredibly broad mission while being the largest land manager in the United States, overseeing some 245 million acres of surface, nearly 1 in 10 acres in our country, ranging from where polar bears live high above the Arctic Circle in Alaska to remote wilderness areas in the Rocky Mountains, to where manatees swim off the shores of Jupiter, Florida. And those lands we manage under our multiple use and sustained yield mandate, ranging from managing wilderness, providing world-class recreation, delivering energy, minerals, food, and timber to the country, running one of the best wildland firefighting organizations in the world, and managing habitat for more than 3,000 wildlife species that depend on our public lands. The BLM also manages a very unique set of public lands, the National Conservation Lands, or the National Landscape Conservation System. These areas are diverse and made up of about 36 million acres now of specially designated areas. This is where we manage our wilderness areas and our wild and scenic rivers. They're part of the system, as are national monuments, national conservation areas, wilderness study areas, national scenic and historic trails, and certain conservation lands in the California desert. And a number of these designations actually overlap on certain landscapes, and we'll get to that. Our National Conservation Lands system is 20 plus years old and currently includes over 900 units designated by Congress and the President to conserve, protect, and restore their unique values, ranging from prehistoric sites to wild rivers to scenic mountain vistas to historic ranches, and all of that mixed together in many places. National conservation lands also can work as a unifying and essential link for habitat and connectivity and for public access across the West. Pathways that are crucial to the nation's efforts to conserve our critical natural resources and at the same time help the public appreciate and enjoy our public lands. And in addition, many of the conservation lands might be remote. Certainly some of the ones I've gotten lost in are, but others are easily accessible and part of an active, vibrant landscape near communities where people live and work and recreate. And many of the designations are ultimately the result of strong grassroots efforts by local communities and organizations. While the National Conservation Lands do conserve biodiversity and cultural resources, they also offer the American people exceptional opportunities for hunting, solitude, wildlife viewing, fishing, history, exploration, research, and a wide range of traditional uses such as livestock grazing. And since we're focused here today on wilderness and wild and scenic rivers, many of these designations end up layered on top of or as part of other conservation lands, with wilderness for instance, designated for wilderness study areas or in national monuments. And as I mentioned, wilderness and wild and scenic rivers are key designations on the lands we manage. The Bureau of Land Management is responsible for 263 wilderness areas and 487 wilderness study areas in the western states and Alaska. From primitive hunting locations to remote fishing spots, wilderness and wilderness study areas provide unparalleled opportunities for spending time outdoors. With over 10 million acres in 10 western states, wilderness areas offer opportunities for solitude, for recreation, for personal reflection. In 1964, Congress established the National Wilderness Preservation System through the Wilderness Act, and since its establishment has passed 150 additional laws adding wilderness areas to the system. Of course, if you know the history of the Bureau of Land Management, we were not included in this initial round of wilderness designation. And to this day, we manage the least wilderness acreage, despite being the largest land manager. We manage about 9% of the acreage within the National Wilderness Preservation System. We do manage wilderness study areas and lands with wilderness characteristics, both of which have the same wilderness character, roadlessness, apparent naturalness, and outstanding opportunities for solitude or primitive unconfined recreation that make up units of the National Wilderness Preservation System. And of course, these lands can grow up to be wilderness someday. So we have opportunities at the BLM to keep increasing our work in this area. Wilderness protects wild and natural landscapes ranging from alpine to desert, forest to grassland. And while the Wilderness Act speaks of lands that appear untrammeled by man, wilderness character is also unavoidably tied to the experience of people in it, as you heard from those wilderness characteristics. This tension, of course, presents some of the challenges for managing recreation in wilderness, but also a lot of technical challenges in conducting minimum requirements and minimum tool analysis when approving other activities while preserving wilderness character. Some of the challenges I know you're all addressing day to day and talking about in this course. And this, of course, does apply as well to certain parts of managing wild and scenic rivers. Congress passed the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act in 1968, establishing the National Wild and Scenic River System to preserve free-flowing rivers for the benefit and enjoyment of present and future generations. The BLM manages 81 designated wild and scenic rivers, totaling nearly 2,700 river miles and 1.2 million acres. In addition to these formally designated wild and scenic rivers, the BLM manages rivers found eligible and suitable for designation. These rivers are found in every Western state where the BLM manages land. In our land use planning processes, the BLM identifies river segments that are eligible for designation as wild and scenic rivers for their wild, scenic, or recreation values, and then determines which are suitable for management. These decisions, made with public input, will guide ongoing management of the river segments unless and until Congress acts. Each wild and scenic river segment is managed to protect and enhance its river values, including free flow, water quality, and outstandingly remarkable values. And we often find ourselves working with the Environmental Protection Agency and state water quality agencies to establish baseline conditions, identify water quality related issues, and develop a strategy to improve or protect water quality in these river segments. So again, these are some more technical skills that our managers develop, and I'm sure you are all working on. They range in with the rivers from working with individuals and guides who want to use the rivers for recreation to applying technical water standards and working with state regulatory agencies. On the right side, the BLM, the National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Forest Service, the 4 federal agencies charged with safeguarding the National Wild and Scenic Rivers System, collaborate actively through the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinating Council, so we can administer wild and scenic rivers in a consistent and coordinated manner across the system. So here, another skill that is required and benefits from creativity, teamwork. And I think in thinking about the BLM lands and wilderness and wild and scenic rivers, I really think of this as part of an overarching framework that definitely requires creativity. The Federal Land Policy and Management Act, our Organic Act, specifically provides for BLM to manage certain areas outside of multiple use and sustained yield, such as wilderness study areas, and wild and scenic rivers. But at the same time, it's really important to think of these areas and all of BLM's national conservation lands and designations, such as backcountry conservation areas or values like wilderness characteristics, as part of the fabric of our public lands. Again, part of the creativity we're looking for from all of you and bringing that together. So wanted to touch on a couple of other current and future aspects of managing wilderness and wild and scenic rivers as part of the public lands. The America the Beautiful initiative is something that we're working hard on in the Biden administration. How we manage lands in addition to the millions of acres of public lands across the West ensures that conservation will be around for many generations to come. And part of the administration's commitment that conservation is part of who we are as a nation. We know that nature is essential to health, to well-being and prosperity of everyone. From the bounty of the Great Plains and vast coastal forests to the high deserts of the Southwest and beyond, our land and waters define who we are and who we as a nation want to be. As directed by President Biden's Executive Order 14008, tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, the Department of the Interior has partnered with other federal agencies to advance an inclusive and collaborative conservation vision. President Biden has issued us a call to action, working together to conserve, connect, and restore 30% of our lands and waters by 2030, supporting our economy, our health, our well-being, our planet. And this is referred to as the America the Beautiful initiative, our first national conservation goal and a decade-long challenge to pursue locally led and voluntary efforts to conserve, connect, and restore lands, waters, and wildlife upon which we all depend. There are a number of key principles guiding these efforts, including honoring, of course, private property rights and supporting voluntary stewardship as part of this framework, pursuing collaborative and inclusive approaches to conservation, supporting locally led and locally designed conservation efforts, honoring tribal sovereignty and supporting tribal priorities, using science as a guide, creating jobs and healthy communities, and building on existing tools and strategies with an emphasis on flexibility and adaptive approaches. And I think that last one, of course, comes into play for all aspects of the BLM's multiple use mandate, but also a lot of what we're going to be discussing in this institute. We have existing tools, we have existing strategies. How do these work in this broader framework? Right now, the federal agencies are getting input from the public on what conservation means and how this continuum of conservation could be part of a conservation and stewardship atlas. But there already have been funding distributed and challenges and opportunities to bring local communities into this effort. And the BLM, of course, manages public lands for the benefit of current and future generations. So supporting conservation is really part of our multiple use and sustained yield mission. And this means respecting the ties that local communities have to public lands and honoring their traditional uses, welcoming new uses and diversity, and of course, respecting Native communities, which brings me to tribal co-stewardship. We do recognize that our public lands are also sacred spaces for Native Americans and lands to which they have current and historic ties and ongoing stewardship. The United States has made solemn promises to tribal nations for more than 2 centuries. Honoring those commitments is particularly vital now as our nation faces crises related to health, the economy, environmental justice, and climate change, all of which can disproportionately harm Native American communities. At the Bureau of Land Management, honoring our relationship with tribal nations, strengthening tribal sovereignty and self-governance, upholding our trust responsibilities, our treaty responsibilities, these are also a paramount part of fulfilling our mission. This means going beyond traditional consultations and outreach and working hard to talk with tribal nations when we take actions that may affect their communities, their historic ties, and their stewardship activities. Late last year, we issued formal guidance to encourage tribal co-stewardship in management of public lands, and we identified many tools we can use to support these arrangements. We're also working to incorporate Indigenous knowledge in our decision-making. So a couple of examples, BLM has been engaged in tribal consultation as part of a proposed 20-year withdrawal of federal lands and minerals within a 10-mile buffer around Chaco Cultural National Historical Park in New Mexico. This would protect these lands from oil and gas leasing on these land, But at the same time, we've kicked off a first of its kind broader collaborative effort, the Honoring Chaco Initiative, to consider tribally led approaches to managing this greater Chaco landscape. Chaco Canyon and the greater connected landscape has a rich tribal and cultural legacy, as well as being a living landscape for tribal communities. The BLM is also working with tribes on management of national monuments. including signing a historic cooperative agreement with the 5 tribes of the Bears Ears Commission and evaluating other opportunities for co-stewardship in management as we develop plans for the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument in Utah and the Aviquame National Monument recently designated in Nevada, as well as discussing opportunities at the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument in California. Right now, the BLM is engaged in over 50 co-stewardship agreements with tribal nations across 15 states. And as the practice expands, we will see more engagement on other lands, including wilderness and wild and scenic rivers, making co-stewardship an important part of the future of management of public lands. And of course, partners for us are a key part of current and future management. We work with countless partners on important challenges and opportunities at the BLM. Visits to public lands, for example, have increased exponentially in recent years. America appears to have rediscovered her public lands during the pandemic, and as we've been saying, they're not going back. It's wonderful that these shared lands can provide a place of refuge and solace and enjoyment during a difficult time. Some 80 million people visited BLM lands in fiscal year 2021, up 10% from the previous year, and we don't expect reductions. And, once BLM managed lands were known more for the natural resources that could be extracted from them. Now they're also known as premier recreation designations: boating, fishing, backpacking, mountain biking, exploration. We see a variety of recreation occurring in Alaska, in Wyoming, in Colorado, in every state. We're seeing increases and expansion of the type of uses that we see, from individuals to families to guides. These opportunities, of course, are available in designated wilderness and wild and scenic rivers, creating a unique challenge as the BLM seeks to meet recreation use demand while conserving, protecting, and restoring the values for which these areas were designated. We're very conscious of and also proud of our responsibility, our privilege in providing this access to the public lands and ensuring everyone can take advantage of them and that future generations can experience them as well. I've seen the growing interest in our public lands firsthand and tried to be better at sharing, as I'm sure all of you are. But again, now that the pandemic has introduced more people to the public lands and proved that many people can work from anywhere, we expect the pressures and the enjoyment to continue. So when it comes to managing recreation, ensuring everyone can still have meaningful experiences on our public lands, partners are key. We need partners for a lot of reasons. More people helps to spread the word, as well as helping get work done. But we also rely on partners for in-kind and financial support, and they rely on us to provide experiences and support local communities. As I mentioned, the BLM was not always seen as a recreation agency, and our budget reflects it. We do have one of the leaner budgets in the federal government. Right now, our main recreation budget line item is $55 million. Less than many states who fund for their recreation departments. And to put our funding in context on the federal scale, on average for the last decade, the National Park Service received through its federal budget an average of about $5.20 a visitor, the Forest Service $1.70 per visitor, and the Fish and Wildlife Service $1.32 per visitor. The BLM comes in at 79 cents per visitor. So partners are very helpful. And of course, other programs that are not just for recreation do help us with our budget, and as do other fees we receive. We estimate we have about $150 million in outdoor recreation funding, but spread over 245 billion acres each year, that's less than $1 an acre. But with this relatively small amount of funding, we feel that we're being creative, we're doing a good job, but it can impact the public we serve, the wildlife habitat we protect. And many of you know that. It's another part of being creative managers, looking where our funding can go, where we can work with partners. We support responsible recreation while we're working to ensure healthy landscapes and wildlife habitat. Of course, increased visitation stresses all of that. And as in wilderness and wild and scenic rivers, there are other uses going on in all of these lands, which is another reason partnering with people who value and use public lands is so key. Whether it's working with a friends group that supports an area in our national conservation lands, or ranchers who can help steward our public lands, or groups advocating for specific types of recreation, or states and counties assisting with search and rescue and responding to wildfire. This, of course, gets to yet another set of skills, working with the public on how they engage in land use planning and learn about public lands, finding ways to let people be heard and to work together. And of course, the overarching challenge, climate change. As public lands managers, we cannot ignore the immense challenge to our public lands from climate change. It affects everything we do, managing wildlife habitat, conserving watersheds, battling wildfires, and all of that can be especially challenging in the framework of managing wilderness and wild scenic rivers. But it doesn't make it any more important, just more challenging and an opportunity for creativity and partnerships. And we certainly, in the most recent season, in the most recent years, we've seen everything from droughts to wildfires to excessive snow and rain. All of these affect management of our public lands, making them more vulnerable to use and increasing the value of wilderness and wild and scenic rivers, both to people and for the resilience of our public lands and the broader ecosystems they support. I want to touch on one last related aspect of future management of public lands, the BLM's proposed public lands rule. This is a proposed regulation that we've just issued recently under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. And this rule will help us to be creative in the future, acknowledging that conservation is part of the BLM's mission through a number of areas of emphasis. We've identified conservation as meaning both protection and restoration, emphasizing these are important uses of the public lands. Our mission doesn't favor one use or another over another, although it gives the Bureau of Land Management a lot of flexibility in evaluating how to create that balance on the landscape. The rule provides for protecting intact landscapes, including identifying areas to manage for intactness and using tools like areas of critical environmental concern, a tool that's unique to the Bureau of Land Management, in which we're directed to prioritize in our land use planning process to manage for a wide range of values. Another area of the rule is restoring degraded landscapes. So prioritizing areas for restoration, directing funding that we might be getting from the Inflation Reduction Act, bipartisan infrastructure law, and using a tool, conservation leases, for restoration and compensatory mitigation, so we can increase the way that third parties might, for instance, actually carry out compensatory mitigation for harm to BLM and public lands on those lands, ensuring that the American public benefits from these important activities and providing surety that lands within a conservation lease will be given the time to recover and for these objectives, mitigation and restoration to occur. And finally, managing responsible development. This remains an important part of BLM's use. We have a mandate from Congress, for example, in the Energy Act of 2020 to cite 25 gigawatts of renewable energy on public lands by 2025. We have a lot to contribute to addressing climate change, both in ensuring that our landscapes are resilient, but also in being part of the transition to a clean energy economy. So the rule would provide for us to have additional support for managing responsibly by applying our land health standards to all uses, not just grazing, ensuring that we're taking into account how ecosystems are functioning when we make decisions on the public lands, and directing managers to avoid actions that will impair ecosystem resilience and requiring justification if those decisions aren't made. And of course, woven throughout the rule is co-stewardship with tribes and use of indigenous knowledge throughout our decision-making. The public lands rule as proposed would be really important for maintaining and improving the resilience and function of our public lands. And it can work with existing designations across the landscape and even help with creative management of them. You must need to be stopping talking soon because it's getting hard. But I want to give an example, as part of citing solar in the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan years ago, a project was actually destroying lands with wilderness characteristics. Because in that area, there was also a designated wilderness area, the company ended up directing their compensatory mitigation funding to improving and restoring and managing trails in that wilderness. So again, this kind of structure in the public lands rule to identify and manage intact landscapes, to put development in the right places, and to provide ways for restoration and compensatory mitigation to happen on public lands can actually benefit some of the designations we're talking about today. The rule is currently open for comment. We're having virtual and in-person informational meetings, and we'd love all of your thoughts on how this all fits together. So in closing, so we can get to some questions and conversation, I just, wanted to reiterate my gratitude for all you're doing. It's going to take all of us to work toward healthy public lands, and managing wilderness and wild and scenic rivers is such an important part of that. These are often people's first introduction to our public lands. And I say that not just as a manager of public lands, but someone who enjoys and loves them, starting with early experiences in the Rio Grande Wild and Scenic River in New Mexico and the Dark Canyon Wilderness in Utah. I personally, and also on behalf of BLM, I'm so grateful that you're helping public lands put their best face forward, while also ensuring their continued health now and into the future. And I'm so happy to be here. I appreciate taking time with me today before you get into the hard and fun work, and want to open it up for questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Nada. So participants, if you would like to just drop your questions into the chat. I see there was one that came up from Soren. Soren, if you want to jump on and ask Nada the question yourself, it's a little lengthy.
Yeah, I don't want to read that out loud, Soren, so I'd love for you to, because I'm afraid I'm going to say something overly emotionally, so please do say it.
Sure. I apologize for the long question, but I've kind of gotten involved in a long process here, trying to figure out how this should work. So I was growing native plants in northern Minnesota as a private person. There's not as much public land in northern Minnesota, and it wasn't really commercially viable. And I was kind of lured to this area in part because I heard BLM staff talk about a need to increase, especially Mojave Desert native plants. Now I'm seeing a lot of land being sacrificed for new solar plants, but I'm not seeing developers invest in trying to avoid destroying obviously valuable horticultural plants that, if we could find a way to increase them in a lawful way, maybe we could reduce demands on them, damage to them from poaching, as well as the kind of stuff that happens when whole landscapes are bulldozed to create these new solar plants. So what is the lawful way that you would encourage partners, and how do we find funding to avoid the destruction of really valuable and rare plants that are not being valued when these lands are being chunked off for solar development? Now that got emotional. Maybe my written question was better, but I hope this helps and helps create more and better comments about how this process should address this loss of really pretty neat and rare plants, valuable plants. Thanks.
Thank you, Soren. And I have, worked on and off with the California Native Plant Society, and they're a wonderful advocate for this. And I do think there's really great opportunities for partnership with the BLM as we're continuing to expand our native seed strategy. But what I like about your idea is it's before we get to the point of seeds, right? It's actually live plant salvage. And I think that's something that we could be, first of all, looking at in right now. We are doing an updated solar programmatic EIS to look at our solar program of where the right places are for solar, but also what are the right standard operating procedures or best practices we should be requiring. And that will get to identifying mitigation. So having this idea in the hopper would be really helpful as we're trying to define mitigation. So I think probably the time has come for it to be considered, and would really love to have that as a comment we could look at, as well as looking for partners. My other experience before I got here is that solar developers are looking for opportunities when they realize they are impacting other resources. And so again, I think getting involved in some of these processes and offering up this idea as part of mitigation would be really helpful. I think the time has come for this. It's a great idea.
Thanks, Nada. We have another question here from our very own Peter Keller, our BLM HQ Wilderness Program lead. And he wants to get your perspective on what do you feel is the mood and perception among members of Congress towards wilderness as a whole?
I would have to say it's as varied as the wilderness areas themselves. We still have, we do have offices that are looking to designate more wilderness and see the value of wilderness for communities and see it as part of public land bills. The bill that passed expanding the Fallon military area in Nevada last year included, to me, it was a really interesting combination of things. It expanded lands for the military. It identified new special areas with co-management for tribes, but also included a significant amount of new wilderness areas. So I think for a lot of folks in the West, they see this as part of the patchwork of what's important for managing public lands. And some places can be wilderness, other places have different values. There certainly are some folks in Congress who use de facto wilderness as kind of their scary music for things that they're concerned are constraining other uses on public land. And I think hearing more and more, hopefully, from the public about the many uses and values of wilderness is always helpful. More education always needed, I think, is the answer as well, Peter. I know that's harder for us to do as federal agencies, but we have wonderful partners who can help with that.
Excellent. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I have a few personally, Nada. You alluded to it a little bit, but what do you think that protections such as wilderness areas and wild and scenic rivers, how can they help us understand and manage the impacts of climate change and other disturbances on public lands?
The nice thing coming from the BLM right now, where, as I mentioned before, we had this multiple use mandate. So there's not an overarching, Congress didn't pick a winner for us, which makes it more challenging to identify a land that might be managed for intactness above all other things. And the wonderful thing about wilderness areas and wild and scenic river segments is we have these laws that say this is overarching priorities for management. It takes them into a different realm for the BLM and for all federal agencies. And so when you're looking at protecting that function, keeping a wilderness area roadless, for example, and keeping a wild segment of a wild and scenic river wild, we are helping to continue the resilience of those lands. It can perform, to me, it has a lot of value for connectivity as well as habitat. And of course, I probably, as you heard me alluding to, consider these kind of our front moving ambassadors of how wonderful public lands are as well. So I think it also helps the public see the value of the way lands can function when they are kept in a more wild state. So all the things.
We have a question from Evan Williams. Nada, you alluded to the programmatic EIS for solar development. Can you remark on any other investigations ongoing or planned for other power generations, such as pumped hydro storage or anything else?
Yeah, so right now, the programmatic effort we have moving is focused on solar, where we've had the biggest jump and the biggest really transformation in technology, where the technology has become something we can manage with less of a footprint and less dramatic measures on public land, and can now be a little bit more flexible on location. So that's how we ended up updating the solar. We do have an existing wind programmatic EIS and an existing geothermal programmatic EIS that identify, they don't prioritize as much as the solar, but they identify areas with a lot of potential. We've heard from a lot of Western states that it would be helpful to update the wind analysis next. So we are looking into that as well. And I don't think, we have not looked at one for pumped hydro at this point. But those, those decisions we're trying to make on a case-by-case basis as much as possible.
Thank you. You brought up the proposed rule, and just to elaborate on that a little bit, the proposed rule envisions BLM putting more focus on ecosystem resilience, and wilderness areas contribute inherently to that goal. How do you feel that wilderness areas and wilderness study areas fit into that landscape intactness components of that proposed rule?
Yeah, it's a fun question. So the rule kind of has two aspects of dealing with intact landscapes, and they both come in at the land use planning stage of identifying landscapes that are intact, so of a significant enough size to really function and support ecosystem habitat, riparian areas, etc. And the rule envisions identifying those areas and then selecting some of those landscapes to be managed for their intactness. And that's a lot broader than saying this one area is a WSA, or this one area is a wild and scenic river. It really provides an opportunity to consider across a larger landscape how a number of these designations might contribute to keeping those landscapes intact and also connecting for a broader landscape. So I think they fit in as you might look first in your land use planning process in areas around wilderness or wilderness study areas or wild and scenic rivers to see where those intact landscapes could be identified. And then I think it also would help in analyzing, where management for intactness might make the most sense in a broader landscape, because we're not just saying once it's identified as intact, immediately that's how it gets managed. We have a lot of intact, happy to say, landscapes in the BLM, and the rule at this moment envisions that happening as part of the public land use planning process. So we would hear from local communities what values those lands have, from our partners, from our cooperating agencies and state and local governments. So again, when you're looking at what lands are best to manage for intactness, I think the presence of some of these other areas like wilderness would help you to design an area that's going to be most successful.
Great. So one of the really fun things about NWSI is just how it brings folks that work in wilderness and wild and scenic rivers together. Really fun just looking through the list of names here. We have our wilderness program lead for BLM, and I've seen numerous BLM park rangers just on this session right now. Since we have such a diverse audience, can you just provide some advice for field staff just right now jumping into wilderness and wild and scenic work?
Just some general advice?
Some general advice. What advice would you give to folks working in wilderness and wild and scenic rivers?
I guess at the outset, I think, first of all, congratulations, and that's very fun. And also that, you have this very specific mandate of how to manage these areas. That gives you some real authority that you might not have as an entry-level person sometimes to say, this is what I can and can't do. Gives you a seat at the table. It also gives you an opportunity, like I said, to be an ambassador for the public lands. We have friends groups, we have local communities who are really excited about these areas. So I would say welcome the partnerships, be it the local communities, the outfitters, the friends groups, people wandering into the office to, really not just protect the areas you're working on, but also bringing people into our public lands. And then, of course, the next step, the advanced degree of difficulty, is working into how you work with everyone around you on public land. Some of our, most of the BLM wilderness and wilderness study areas are not that small, but they're not that big either. And so I think that's that ultimate challenge is you are, quote unquote, special designations, but you're also ultimately part of this broader fabric of public land. So just keep thinking about that perspective as well.
Thank you. And we have time for 2 more questions. Next one up is coming from Risa Shimoda. Risa, can you jump on and ask yours?
Hi, sure. I'm going to read it because I don't know if I could remember everything I wrote. As we learn more about the degree to which we were not very nice and took a lot of land from a lot of people across the country, we're trying to learn, first what happened, how to honor what happened, to honor those from whom we took stuff, information about the traditions that still exist and what's happening regarding this kind of, I view as slow unfurling of co-management and kind of trying to do what's best and balance. As both river managers in our technical jobs, what we're supposed to be doing, and then as personally as stewards to the degree at which we can act on personal interest, what do you suggest for us to learn, practice, do more, restore balance that both honors tradition and acknowledges river and land use that has developed over decades since, in the last decades and centuries. So we're trying, we can't fix much in a day, but what would you suggest for us who want to help? And sometimes we don't know.
Since we've started, this administration, I think, has been unusual in that, I don't know that people were surprised that in the first day or two of the administration, President Biden issued executive orders on climate, but he also issued a presidential direction on honoring our government to government relationship and honoring tribal nations. So from day one, this administration has really been focused on how to try to, work with tribes. And on public lands, we've basically been inviting tribes in to say, what would be the most important thing for you? What can we do here? What are the areas you're most interested in, both in terms of locations and being engaged? And what can, and then obviously, once you tell us what you want to do, how could we help you do it? Because I think part of the challenge over the years has been where we've said, oh, we want you to come in and work with us, tribes, and they've come in. If we don't have funding to help them, that has been challenging because it can be seen as an empty promise, even though it's not intended that way. So I think what I've learned so far here in 2 years of getting the opportunity to have these conversations with tribes is, a lot of tribes have been frustrated with our formal consultation process, where we send a formal letter, have a very structured meeting. That has been, not that they want us to not do that and not that we would ever not comply with that process, but there really is a hunger for a more extensive engagement and trying to make that connection in the terms of saying this is not going to supplant what we know our legal obligations are, but more it's we want to listen and we want to hear what your connections are to the landscape score management and how we can best engage you in that management. And that has seemed to lead to a lot of conversations. It's not fast, but as you noted, Risa, it was a long time getting to this point already. So having some patience with hearing what the connections are to the landscape, what the wrongs are that they remember, and how they might want to engage with us has been the way we've opened up the most fruitful conversations. One of the things that's been interesting to me and sobering, and yet also kind of honoring as a public servant, is we are meeting with tribes who are telling us stories that they haven't shared before because they have felt, why should we share our stories of the bad things that we experience on public lands? What does that get for us? We don't trust you with our stories. And trying to now have this culture where they are willing to trust us with their stories because there's something we can do in response to that, whatever creativity it is. It has been really something I have really felt lucky to be a part of. And so I would encourage you all to see what you can create. And we have a lot of, if you want to, even though if you're not into the BLM, if you want to look at our guidance, there's a huge list there of all the various legal ways you can work with tribes. Some of them involve sharing funds, some of them don't. We have a lot of room to partner, and it's not one size fits all. So
Great, thank
kind of
you.
having a moment here.
Thank you, Neda. But let's all thank Neda Culver for joining us for as the keynote and kicking off this 2023 National Wilderness Skills Institute. Thank you, Neda.
Thanks for having me. And I'm sorry I didn't have a million pictures of beautiful wilderness, and I hope you get a lot more of them with subsequent speakers. So thanks for having me.
We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.